In this episode, we connect privacy and sensitive data protection to real system design choices. Because privacy is not just a legal topic, and it is not just a policy statement. It is something that must be built into how systems collect, store, use, and share information. Beginners sometimes treat privacy as a separate checkbox that happens after the system is designed, but that approach usually creates painful rework, especially when the system already depends on data it should not be collecting or retaining. Privacy regulations and sensitive data standards push architects to think carefully about what data is truly needed, who can access it, and how long it should exist. They also force you to design for transparency and accountability, meaning you can explain what the system does with data and prove that it follows the rules. This becomes especially important when systems integrate across teams and partners, because data can move farther than anyone intended. The exam tends to test whether you can translate privacy expectations into architecture choices that are practical, enforceable, and aligned with the principle of using only what you need. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful first step is to define what we mean by sensitive data, because sensitive does not only mean secret, and it does not only mean personal. Sensitive data can include personal information that identifies someone, financial information, health information, authentication data, and confidential business information, among other categories. Sensitivity is partly about harm, meaning what could happen if the data is exposed, altered, or used improperly, and partly about obligation, meaning what rules apply to it. Privacy regulations often focus on personal data, but sensitive data standards may cover additional categories like payment data or government identifiers. In architecture, sensitivity is important because it determines what protections must exist and how strict those protections must be. You cannot protect everything equally, because that would make systems unusable, so you classify and prioritize. When you classify data in a clear and usable way, you can design controls that match risk, and you can explain those controls during audits or incident reviews. Once you know what sensitive data is, the next concept is purpose limitation, which is the idea that data should be collected and used only for specific, legitimate purposes. In system design, purpose limitation forces you to ask why each data element is being collected and what feature depends on it. If a feature can work without collecting a sensitive field, the safest design is to not collect it at all, because you cannot leak what you never store. Beginners often assume more data is always better, but in privacy-aware architecture, unnecessary data is a liability that increases risk and compliance burden. Purpose limitation also helps prevent misuse, because data collected for one reason can be tempting to reuse for another reason that was never disclosed. Architects translate this idea into requirements that constrain data collection, define allowed uses, and prevent systems from quietly expanding data usage over time. This is one of the strongest privacy design tools because it reduces exposure at the source. Data minimization is closely related but slightly different, because it emphasizes collecting the least amount of data necessary to meet the stated purpose. If purpose limitation answers why you need data, minimization answers how much you really need. In design terms, minimization can mean using less granular data, using aggregated data, or avoiding persistent identifiers when temporary ones would work. It can also mean avoiding free text fields that accidentally capture sensitive details and are hard to control. For example, a system might not need a full birth date when an age range is sufficient, or it might not need a full address when a region is enough. These choices are architectural because they shape database schemas, application flows, and integration interfaces. Minimization often improves security and performance too, because smaller datasets are easier to protect and manage. Exam questions may reward the option that reduces data exposure while still meeting business needs, because that reflects privacy-aware architectural thinking. Another major privacy-driven design requirement is data lifecycle control, meaning you design how data is created, stored, accessed, retained, and deleted. Many systems are good at collecting data and terrible at letting go of it, which becomes a problem when regulations or standards require limited retention. Architects must ensure that retention periods are defined, that data is archived or deleted appropriately, and that deletion is not just a UI action but a real process that removes data from primary storage and handles copies like backups according to policy. You also need to consider derived data, such as logs, analytics outputs, and reports, because sensitive information can appear in places no one expects. A common beginner mistake is to focus only on the main database and ignore everything around it. A privacy-aware design treats data as flowing through multiple components and ensures the lifecycle rules apply across the whole system. This is where standards meet reality, because the system must be designed to enforce lifecycle promises consistently. Access control for sensitive data is a core security topic, but privacy adds an extra layer, because privacy is not only about keeping outsiders out, it is also about limiting what insiders can do. In many real incidents, data is misused by authorized users who have more access than they need, or by staff who access data without a legitimate reason. Architecture must support least privilege access, role-based boundaries, and strong accountability so sensitive access is intentional and reviewable. You also need to think about segregation, meaning some functions should not be able to both access data and approve their own access, because that creates opportunities for abuse. Another privacy-oriented idea is context-based access, where certain sensitive operations require additional checks, such as stronger authentication or extra approval, even for legitimate users. The goal is not to make work impossible, but to make misuse harder and more visible. When you design access with privacy in mind, you are reducing the risk of both external breaches and internal misuse. Encryption and protection of data in transit and at rest are often discussed as privacy controls, but it is important to understand what they do and do not accomplish. Encryption protects data from being read if storage is stolen or if traffic is intercepted, but encryption does not automatically prevent misuse by someone who legitimately has access to decrypt it. That is why encryption must be paired with access controls, key management practices, and monitoring. Architecture choices also include where encryption happens, how keys are protected, and how access to keys is controlled and logged. Sensitive data standards often require encryption as a baseline, but the architect must ensure the design makes encryption effective rather than decorative. Another architectural consideration is whether sensitive data can be tokenized or otherwise transformed so that systems can function without storing the original values everywhere. This reduces exposure and can simplify compliance because fewer components handle the most sensitive forms of data. The exam will often favor layered protection rather than a single control treated as a cure-all. Privacy regulations also introduce rights and expectations that affect system features, such as the ability to access, correct, or delete personal data, depending on the applicable rules. From an architecture standpoint, this means the system must be able to locate a person's data across components, present it in a usable form, and apply updates consistently. That is harder than it sounds because data often spreads across services, caches, logs, and analytics stores. Architects may need to design identifiers and data mapping so that data can be discovered and managed reliably, while also ensuring those identifiers do not create new privacy risks. This is a classic architectural trade-off, because strong linkage helps fulfill rights requests, but can also increase correlation risk if misused. A good design often includes careful scoping of identifiers, clear separation between identity data and activity data where possible, and controls that limit who can perform rights-related operations. The goal is to make privacy rights practical without creating new attack paths. Another important theme is data sharing and onward transfer, especially in systems that integrate with partners, vendors, or internal departments. Privacy obligations often follow the data, meaning it remains protected even after it leaves the original system. Architects must design integration interfaces that share only what is necessary, protect the data during transfer, and ensure the receiving system is authorized and appropriately controlled. This can involve designing clear data contracts between systems, defining allowed uses, and ensuring that sensitive data is not accidentally exposed through overly broad interfaces. It also involves monitoring, because if data is being shared, you need evidence of what was shared and to whom. especially if incidents occur. In real organizations, integration is where privacy often fails, because it is easy to add one more field to an interface without considering downstream effects. A privacy-aware architect treats data sharing as a controlled design decision with traceable justification. Logging and monitoring create another privacy trade-off, because while logs are essential for security and auditability, logs can also become a source of sensitive data leakage. Beginners often assume more logging is always better, but privacy-aware design asks what should be logged, what should be masked, and who can access logs. For example, logging full sensitive values can create unnecessary exposure, while logging identifiers and event context can still provide useful evidence without revealing everything. Architecture must also protect logs, because if logs contain sensitive access history or fragments of personal data, they become a high-value target. This means access control, retention rules, integrity protection, and monitoring apply to logs as well. A good design balances the need for detection and investigation with the need to reduce sensitive data proliferation. Exam questions may test whether you recognize that evidence collection must be privacy-conscious, not careless. Bringing privacy regulations and sensitive data standards into real designs also requires a cultural shift in how teams make trade-offs. Privacy is not only a constraint, it is also a quality attribute of the system, like reliability or usability, because it affects user trust and organizational risk. Architects help by embedding privacy requirements early, translating them into concrete design rules, and ensuring those rules are measurable and testable. They also help by defining patterns that teams can reuse, such as how to handle sensitive fields, how to design consent-related flows if needed, and how to structure data storage to support lifecycle and rights. When patterns exist, teams deliver faster because they do not reinvent decisions, and privacy compliance becomes easier because consistent designs are easier to verify. This is how you avoid slowing development while still meeting strong obligations, because the architecture provides a clear path rather than vague warnings. Over time, privacy becomes a normal part of design thinking instead of a last-minute scramble. To conclude, applying privacy regulations and sensitive data standards to real system designs means turning principles into concrete architecture constraints that shape data flows, storage, access, and lifecycle. You begin by identifying what data is sensitive and why, then apply purpose limitation and minimization so the system collects only what it truly needs. You design lifecycle controls so retention and deletion are real, not just policy words, and you build access control with accountability to reduce misuse by both outsiders and insiders. You use encryption and transformation techniques thoughtfully, understanding their limits and pairing them with other controls. You also design for rights and transparency where applicable, and you treat data sharing and logging as controlled decisions that balance security needs with privacy protection. When you approach privacy this way, you build systems that earn trust, reduce compliance risk, and perform well under audit or incident scrutiny, which is exactly the kind of architectural judgment the exam is looking for.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.